All right, we're live.
Yeah, we are live.
Frances.
What's up? Hey,
Brittany.
man, it's Brittany.
Check out these socks. It's Christmas time. Hi, Aaron.
Wave. What's up, Aaron?
Hi, guys. How we doing?
What's up?
We got Brittany in here from Sacramento.
Mm-hmm. Just defended her thesis.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you. Officially master Brit.
How does it feel?
It feels amazing. It's not over yet, but it feels amazing.
Yeah. Still got a ways to go, but we're almost there. Home stretch.
Yep.
Right?
Definitely.
And we got Frances here from Puzzle Performance.
What's up, guys?
So thanks for joining today. So this is going to be Transition Performance's first live video.
And Puzzle Performance's first live video.
And puzzles, and Brittany, she's been at it for a while, so.
Just one time. Second time. One time.
So the way that we're going to do things today is basically, so Brittany, she specializes in athlete burnout and athlete identity. So for those of us that are still with us, and if this is something that you're interested in learning about how athletic identity can help improve performance and what are some of the detriments to that, we're gonna find out from Brittany here how you can help them with their those issues that they're working with, and also avoid some potential possibilities of burnout. So if you want to add anything to that, Brittany.
Well, I want to. Do we have kind of that agenda that we're going by? I just want to make sure
Yeah. So I mean, I have a couple questions.
Okay.
That. So Laura from the lab.
Hi, Laura. we got a
she's
three-way Instagram live here. This is like Instagram liveception.
Yeah.
And we got Brandon here.
Hey, Brandon.
Kevin Hall, thanks for being here. Oh, thank you for joining. Thank you for joining. This is our first Instagram live, so we're gonna get started. Frances has sort of our agenda today on what we're gonna be doing. So take it away, Frances.
Yeah. So I figured we start with just kind of like sharing with everyone what athletic identity is, kind of like letting people know what kind of it is, the concept that we're talking about, and then go into kind of like how does it impact performance, like why is this something that we study and research, why we address as consultants, and take it to like the youth sport level, like even from like a youth sport perspective, like why is that important to look at this, especially in kids as they grow up in sport. Maybe talk about some injury. I know, Seth, that's kind of your area too, looking at it with injury. And then kind of what maybe we can get into, like what can we do as consultants, or what are some things that parents can do, coaches can do to help address this, so that we're raising kids up in sport programs to develop that healthy identity that's going to prepare them for not only athletic success but personal success.
Okay.
Perfect.
So you're gonna hit us off with a question that.
Yeah, sure. So let's start just with talking about like what is athletic identity? How do we define that?
All right, I'll start. Maybe we can just go down.
Yep.
So I think the way I define it is basically the degree to which an individual identifies with their athletic role. That's just how I would just define it myself.
Athletic role meaning like their role on a team, or just how they view themselves as an athlete?
Yeah, I would say both. Okay. I would say both.
Frances, you want to build off that?
Yeah, I mean, I think who you are as a person and how that relates to the way you approach your sport performance, how you see yourself as a human being and an athlete, how do those two intersect, is how I
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I think the one thing that I'd like to add, and this is sort of like me, and the way that I talk with people is more analytical, and I give more analogies on things just to make it stick. So I just had a recent conversation with one of my good buddies, Bryce Afferano. Bryce, if you're going to look at this, thanks for this one. So we talked about, viewing you as not just one piece of the puzzle. So we got to have puzzle performance here. So we're going to take a spin on her name. If you look at like what type of puzzle you have multiple pieces to that puzzle, right? So each individual piece is an aspect of whether that's your life, school, family, friends, and also athletic identity. People joining in, Robert. So if you were to look at athletic identity in particular, what piece of that puzzle is it, and how big is it?
Okay.
So when we look at certain aspects like club sport and youth specialization, that piece is usually pretty large, or if not the whole thing. So let's just say, for example, somebody gets injured. Like for myself, I went through a pretty big knee injury. Once that's removed, you have a big empty gap, right? So that gap is all the rest of the pieces to that puzzle: family, friends, other things. Youth, they like to, scooter, video games, all that stuff is minimalized, and then they go through those potential issues that you might see on the youth side. So
okay, if we can go off of that, I'm kind of curious with when an athlete goes through that injury kind of process, rehab and things like that, and they have that identity, I guess, crisis, maybe we can say, how do you think they can get through that? Or maybe from your personal experience, you know what I mean? Like, just how did you handle that crisis of struggling with your identity? Did it open up your eyes to other roles that you had, to see yourself in a different light?
Right, yeah. And I think leading into that's sort of what type of coping strategies an athlete might have when it comes to whether it's removal from a sport or injury, or maybe transferring different teams. Maybe they're with a starting point guard on one team, and they get to another team, and now they're playing backup. Right. So the that sort of star, that fame that they had before, it's no longer there. And it all starts, for me personally, with whatever social support you have.
Okay.
Right. So for me, in my injury, when I went through my injury, if I didn't have the support from my friends, my family, loved ones, I would have been caught in a very low point of my life. So having those people around you sort of aid in that process during your initial kind of issue that you might have, right? So for me, it was definitely social support, and then you get into a lot of other things, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, and I think, going back to kind of like the self-esteem and like the performance-based self-esteem, I think can be an issue, because I think if that's really high, if you rely on your sport and your athletic identity to kind of receive that feeling of worth and value, then I think that process can be a lot more difficult.
Right.
And
yeah. And we know that self-esteem and self-worth is tied to things like confidence and how people perform, optimally. So if that self-esteem isn't there, they lose the confidence, and then especially when they come back to a sport or anything like that, they might not have the confidence that they did prior, right?
Right.
You want to add on to that, Frances?
Yeah, I think I kind of want to backtrack a little bit, and like when we talk about like that self-esteem and where that comes,
no problem,
and like where it comes from in sport,
what's up, David?
I think that gets a lot at the idea of there's a difference between saying I'm a baseball player versus I'm a person who plays baseball. Or like in your case, like Seth, like I, Seth, am a soccer player versus like I'm Seth and I happen to play soccer kind of thing. And I think that's where when we wrap it up in the like I am, like for me it was I am a dancer. Like this is who I am. This is what I live, breathe. Like this is my life. This is all I know. And especially from a youth level, like, kids might be going to school for 6 hours of the day and then going to practice after, like, they do other things when that view is developed as who I am as a human being is wrapped up in the sport that I play or the performance venue that I compete in. That's where we start to kind of walk that line of, like, okay, my identity as a person is wrapped up in my sport.
Now, I think where this gets interesting, though, and where the debate starts is, I mean, if you want to be, the greatest at what you do you make that sacrifice? Like, I'm going to put everything I am into this, and I am going to define myself as a basketball player, as a swimmer, whatever, and is that necessary to get to the top? You know what I'm trying to say?
Right, yeah. And I think
that's where
I think to an extent, like when we're talking about elite sports, when we look at like professional athletes, Olympic athletes, like that is almost a necessity because their entire, from the second they wake up, even through their REM cycles of sleep, they have to be in that mindset to be as good as they are. But at the same time, like when do you start that? When is it healthy to start that? And I think from my perspective, I think as a youth athlete, like, do 7, 8, 9-year-olds need to be living that mindset? Probably not. I think where, you know, and we talk about athletes retiring, and you mentioned in your defense, like, about, like, retirement from I think where we can kind of help athletes is when, as a kid, they develop that multifaceted identity, so that when they have to hone in and really focus on, okay, I gotta live, breathe, eat, sleep my sport, I can do that because I know that it's only for a period of time, and after I can go back to all these other things.
Right. Yeah. And I think too that comes with, I mean, if you're listening still, thank you for joining our Instagram Live. But I think what Frances was just going off of, when you get to that elite level, there's a big with society today in America, in the U.S., and with the culture that we have with sports and making it to the top, so many young athletes are looking at these professional teams and professional athletes, and they want to be there. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, our country does not really do a great job at helping these athletes kind of like get that dream that they want. So a recent article that I read was, when we look at Olympic athletes in general, about 48% of them, after they're said and done with either training, and maybe they don't get to that Olympic level, but if they don't, hey Julio, if they don't get to that Olympic level, they feel unprepared getting into that real world. Versus another country like Canada, they actually give stipends to their Olympic athletes when they're training for quads and things like that. Okay. And then afterwards, if they don't make it or whatever happens, they actually they will help pay for their education. Where here in the U.S., we've heard stories of countless athletes trying to make cut times for Olympic trials. Maybe they're living at home with their parents, or they're living at Olympic training center dorms, and they can't work part-time because they have to train, and they make that sacrifice. But it's like a push-pull, like a double-edged sword, right? Like, do I give up everything to train and, treat myself as just an athlete? What's the risk reward?
That's hard.
I'll be able to make it to the Olympics. I might be able to get some money off of sponsorships, and maybe at track and field I might be able to go compete at the Diamond League level. But other than that, like, I'm taking a big risk to help provide for myself later on, right?
I think you find the same issue, I mean, going off what Seth is saying, you find the same issue at the NCAA kind of level, where you have athletes that are putting everything they have into training, and to being that top, athlete, so they can get drafted to go here and there, but what about the degree? What about your education, and what about putting, effort and thought into that life after sport? Because we're talking about 1%. We're talking about the 1% that are going to make it. So I think this is kind of a debate, but I think something that should be brought up as far as, like, parents, and kind of how you handle that youth sport period of time, you know what I mean? And having your child athlete, train and try to maximize that talent, but at the same time understand that sports are not going to be around forever. Even if they go pro, they retire at 35. You know what I mean? You got a whole life ahead of you. So, prioritizing education, or at least other interests outside of sport, is important. Because again, even if you do make it, it's not going to be a lifelong journey there.
Yeah. Well, and I think even getting at it from like a was it the positive youth sport development model, that USOC is now like buying into and kind of putting out there too. I think a really big chunk of it does start at the youth level, but letting kids experience more than one sport. letting your kids, get into multiple sports as a kid. So maybe it's in the fall they're playing football, in the winter they're playing basketball, in the spring they're playing baseball, kind of thing. Or
you're saying multiple sports?
Yeah, where it's like, not only do we know from the research that physiologically that helps their athletic development prior to age, was it like 12 to 13, something like that. But that identity-wise, then they've learned that they haven't grown up their whole life by the time they get to high school thinking, all I know is this one sport. I know, all these other sports.
And if I could just add something real quick. And also, I think, going off of that, they also, they're probably not going to be the star at every sport they play, right? So being able to teach, a youth athlete to know how to be a role player, you know what I mean? They might be a star at basketball, or they play baseball, and they're not the best on the team. So be able to kind of navigate that, too. Because I think a lot of times kids, they have that success at a young age, and then they kind of go with that, and it can get messy towards the end when they encounter adversity. But I think going off of that, playing different sports could, you know what I'm trying to say?
It teaches them to embrace both success and failure.
There we go.
Right.
There we go.
They've been exposed to both.
Also, too, parents, if you're listening, or even anybody that is looking at and watching baseball, look at Aaron Judge, right? Aaron Judge came in as a rookie, dominated, and people were like, man, this guy's a prodigy. He's a beast. Almost broke the home run record his first year. He played 3 sports in high school, and he could have played 3 sports in college. He was really great at football, really great at basketball, and ultimately chose baseball at Fresno State.
Wow.
So when you look at even the best of the best, they're coming up and they're learning different skills. It's going to translate well overall for the well-being of that kid, and then also too translating into life, how to manage different things. So even top performers like Aaron Judge, they know that this specialization and also the types of training that they're doing will translate not just from the field or the court, but also to life and other things as well.
That's good. We got a question from Rob.
Yeah. So for all of our other followers, Rob.
Thanks for joining us, guys. We're doing a triple I agree IG live right now.
Springfield, yeah.
Springfield.
Rob said Springfield, getting
Out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Springfield.
But you had a good question.
So we got a question
or
here.
what would you all say is the appropriate age to start to specialize in a sport, or is it appropriate at all?
So the question is, when should youth athletes specialize in a sport? At what age?
So those of us that are still here, if you want to chime in, we have, when do you think is an appropriate age for somebody to specialize in a sport?
Sorry, Rob.
So we're gonna go ahead and debate that right now and talk about that. Rob, chime in if you wanna add anything.
Yeah, we want to know your thoughts.
Yeah. I think. Well, I mean, again, I think positive youth sport development model says what is it? I think somewhere between 12 and 14 is when kids should start specializing. I agree with that. I think from anecdotally and that kind of thing. I think from a research standpoint, let kids play different, experience different sports up to that kind of like preteen years. Let them develop not only cognitively but physiologically as well, and then kind of pick that one. Then let them make the choice. And I think I agree with that from multiple standpoints. Like logistically, thinking about it from a parent's role, as a parent, you're the one driving them to soccer, basketball, baseball, football, dance, whatever. You're the one carting them around. And so I think at a certain point at that age, and especially if they have siblings too, let them play and then specialize later on, so that as a parent you can keep your sanity too, but then as a kid they still get to have that experience.
Yeah.
I think, let's just say an athlete, their parent is primarily invested in one sport. So let's just say a youth athlete in cycling. Maybe they start mountain bike racing when they're super, super young, and their mom and dad come from a cycling family. A perfect example is U.S. Olympian Taylor Phinney from the U.S. His mom was on the World Tour for females, and he got into cycling at a really young age. So when you look at that model, it's easier for the parents to maneuver the kids around because they're doing the same maybe events, doing the same sort of training, they're the same culture, the same lifestyle, right? But then think about those that maybe their parents didn't play any sports when they were in high school or anything like that. So you have these parents that maybe don't know what basketball is, but the little Jimmy wants to play basketball, right? So let them enjoy all those different things. But in my personal opinion, if they're going to specialize in something, then I would say probably around that like freshman year of high school, because that's around 14, and that's just above that age that they say is a good kind of transition for them to have that early specialization, and then from there I would think, because then they can invest their full time into year-round training. Mom and dad don't have to worry about spending so much money on all these different sports and travel ball and all that stuff. So I would say around that freshman year is my opinion. Yeah.
I would say that I would agree with you guys, but I'll say this: if you're gonna have the kids specialize at 6, at least let them have a hobby. That's all I'm gonna say. At least allow them to enjoy other things.
We'll get to that question.
Allow them to enjoy other things, have other interests, and be a normal kid. Because I think it just gets dangerous when all of a sudden they're just, it's like they're 6 and they're working a full-time job. You know what I mean? And they're traveling every day, every weekend, across the country, at 12 years old, things like that. So, because I know parents, actually, I don't even know what I'm going to do with my own kid. I might have them start playing at a young age. Because I'm about that kind of stuff. But I want to make sure that they have that normal kid experience. They're not being, overwhelmed emotionally and physically. But I would say specializing around the age of 12 to 14 would be fine.
Yeah, and so let's talk about this specializing. So my player EQ, thanks for being with us today. You probably know Brittany from Heart and Soul Performance.
I've seen you guys before.
Yeah.
Frances, Puzzle Performance. So she says, can you define what you think specializing is? Is that year-round travel ball, or just training the same sport year-round with other sports being played? I think what we're kind of talking about is just one sport, right?
That's how I define specialization too.
Yeah, so specialization would be one sport year-round, training and competing.
Yeah, so that's when they're using baseball, softball as an example. Like you're playing like travel ball all year round, plus doing maybe a rec league on the side. If you're at the high school level, doing high school 2 in the spring. It's like when that is the only sport that you're participating in within a 12-month period.
I would say during the off season is time for baseball. It's time to go to the bullpen and go to training facilities and stuff like that to get extra training in on the off season to work on fundamentals and things like that. Maybe strength training, focusing on nutrition and things like that. But as far as thanks for joining us, guys, Patrick, Andre, or just training the same sport year round with other sports. That's the key thing, is having other sports in the picture. So early youth specialization would be just that one sport.
I want to piggyback off that, but I want to share Rob kind of chimed in and he said it's a tough question, but I agree. It's context specific, but I think the ultimate decision should come from the athlete. However, parents should be aware of their child's level of interest, commitment, reason to participate in their sport, effort at practice and competition. I think all those things, taking them all into consideration, Rob hit it on the head. But my kind of question, piggybacking off of that when we're talking about specialization, is so then the debate kind of grows even further when we're talking about what about the sports where specialization at an early age is almost necessary. So I'm talking about sports like gymnastics, ice skating, figure skating. What are some of the other ones? Like tennis sometimes, sports where it's maybe golf, where you see kids going where the normal age to go professional is 14, 15 years old. So then how do we account for those where that's their justification, is you peak before you graduate high school?
Well, I would say to that, and I'll just plug us in, I think if that's just how that ball game goes and that's just what's expected, I think if you're specializing at a young age and that's just how it goes, I think that just make sure that youth athlete is feeling supported, and again, have a gauge as far as their interest level and how much they're enjoying it and whether or not they're being overwhelmed. But I think just equip that youth athlete with everything they need to continue to enjoy that journey, and that may include mental skills training.
What would be, I'd be curious, like, what would be your guys' suggestion when you have, like, if you have a parent? So, like, when we're talking about youth kids, it's the parents that are going to ultimately make the decision whether they pull them from, a team or not, or make them continue to play the one sport. And the parents are the ones that, paying for all the equipment, paying for training and all of that. Mm-hmm. What would be kind of your suggestion for the parent who has an athlete dealing with like that loss of interest, maybe they're starting to get into that specialization period where they decide, I'm going to choose soccer over baseball and basketball. I think that's going to be my sport, but the parents have invested all this money in the other two sports and they're having a difficult time like dealing with that. How would you guys approach that situation?
Real quick, I just want to say for all the other people that are joining, we're doing an Instagram live right now with Heart and Soul. This is Brittany Mitchell, and then we got Frances Cacho from Puzzle Performance. Thanks for joining. We're answering questions on athletic identity. And also, if you have any questions on athletic identity, burnout, recovering from injury, things like that, shoot them through the comment section and we'll try to answer those for you. This is for you, and also just to give you guys a little bit more knowledge on athletic identity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So, Francis, your question was, how do you deal with that parent who invests, the time and the money and all that kind of stuff into a kid specializing in a sport, mm-hmm. and then they lose interest or they go down a different path with another sport? That's your question?
Yeah. So, like, you have a kid who's maybe been trying, like, 3 different sports, and then they get to that age where they're ready to start specializing, and they decide, hey, I think this is the sport I'm going to choose. What would be your recommendations to the parents who are maybe having a difficult time letting go of the other 2 sports because they've invested money in those sports too?
I mean, I guess I would ask the parent, bring it back to the basics, right? Why did you put your kid in sports to begin with? You know what I mean? Was it for you? Mm-hmm. Was it for, Or was it for the...
for them?
Or is it for the kid? And, if the kid is doing what the kid loves to do, say it's soccer and that's not what you intended for the kid to do, you know what I mean? Just really, really looking at your motives, and it's about the kid. And if it's not about the kid, then maybe that needs to be a different conversation.
Yep. Yeah, because we see a lot of the times parents trying to play through their kids and things like that. Yeah. And then they get all standoffish. No, I swear. And by no means am I a parent. But what I do observe and what I see, I'm a parent of two dogs. But what I do see when I'm working with parents and their kids,
I like that answer,
is there's a lot of
keep it real, keep it transparent.
There's a lot of times where you kind of feel it from the parents, and then the kids might feel pressured. They might feel expectations, and that often will lead to more issues of burnout later on when it comes to their identity. Right? Are they doing it for them? They lose the fun and like the enjoyment of playing sports. So
I feel like that almost opens up like a whole other can of worms with athletic identity. Now we're starting to talk about like parental athletic identity.
Yeah, so maybe we should keep it back on track, right? Go back on track.
That's good, but
I think that's just like another example of how like when you tie your identity to
let the kid choose their path.
Sport,
yes.
Like when you tie your identity to your sport, like if you don't recognize that, and develop those multiple identities, if you lose out on that, if you're not in that 1%, how that can then later affect you down the road as even a parent and your interaction with your kids.
That's what I'm saying. You know what I mean? That's what I was saying in my defense.
Yeah.
I feel like the child athlete and like the parent relationship, it's going to be there before sport, and I hope it's going to be there after the sport, and I think we've got to be intentional about making sure that relationship isn't solely tied to that sport. Mm-hmm. You can imagine how that can kind of get muddy,
Yeah.
Yep.
You know what I mean? We could go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So do we have another question lined up on our end as far as our agenda that we were supposed to keep track of?
Just send them through.
By the way, look at this beautiful campus right here. Yeah, this is in front of Titan Gym. And we're in the corner. We're just chilling in the corner right over here.
My colleagues, Seth Rose and Frances Cacho.
All right, let's get back to the agenda.
The Sharply Athlete, thanks for joining me and my friends here.
How's it going?
We're having a conversation about athletic identity, burnout, all that kind of stuff.
What do we got?
How that can help performance and how it can possibly hurt it. We're talking about parent and child relationships in sport. What's up? We're just having a fun dialogue.
Julio.
Send any questions if you got them.
You learned well, my friend.
Athletic identity.
He says, what is the ideal age to begin introducing psychological skills training, nice abbreviation, with children?
What's the ideal age? What's the ideal age to introduce?
So that's a good one, Julio. You want to tell me? Part of your final?
What do you think?
So I think, Dan Gould is a classic pioneer to sports psychology, applied sports psychology services, and he's from Michigan State, and he actually does a lot of youth specialization when it comes to psychological skills training and mental skills. And what we see is we can start introducing these things as little as about 8 years old, 9 years old to 10 years old.
What do you think?
But in my case, in my experiences when I worked at IMG Sports Academy in Florida, working with 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds with the parents that have a lot of money to invest in these kids, they're there to have fun, and they don't really care about relaxing or things like that. And if you even were to ask them like what pressure is, or if they've ever felt pressure before, they usually can't answer that question.
I think part of that is they just don't have the self-awareness to understand that what I'm feeling is pressure, too.
Yeah.
And I feel bad even bringing that question up.
Yeah.
Because, like, am I introducing it to them?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
It's like you're lighting the fire.
It's like they're on
I think in some cases
we died.
Oh, no.
You died.
Uh-oh, we died.
We died.
Uh-oh.
Maybe some of your followers will come on our live.
Unless he's a Sharpman athlete, I think I got him on here. But anyways, so
Dang it.
to Julio, to answer your question, I think 10 to 12 is like prime time, because then you start developing more of the key core mental skills that you know and that we know, things like goal setting, relaxation, maybe a little bit of imagery, but starting it more just like visually seeing stuff.
I would almost argue that like you could, like, the more I'm thinking about it, like an 8-year-old would grasp it, and maybe you're not teaching them like this is how you do imagery, or this is how you visualize. Maybe it's more of you're noticing maybe they're just a kid who has trouble with dealing with failure, or they're a kid, I'm trying to think of like some of the 8-year-olds we had at IMG when we were there, like that just struggle with like challenge, and maybe you're just helping them process challenge or deal with the emotions that come from experiencing loss, because I think that's something that even at 8 years old kids get frustrated.
They see the growth mindset, like helping them develop that.
I think it looks different at that age, but I think if you're talking about actually developing kind of more like those periodized skills, that what you're talking about, maybe 10, 12 might be a little bit more appropriate, where they have
gotta
that
make it for them, make it adaptable, and adjust it for them, and know where they're at, and make it fun.
What if you kind of go down the life skills route, though, too? Like, I don't know, that might sound a little mature.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like, actually, I don't know what I mean.
We're professional here.
Okay, so I kind of want to like take a detour and like kind of segue back to our agenda. So we talked about, I want to go back to the injury piece for a little bit in a second, but we talked about the parents, but what can we suggest to coaches to help their athletes develop a healthy athletic identity, which I feel like is kind of it's counterintuitive, because as a coach your focus is the sport, like you're there to teach them about the sport, but at the same time I feel like if you're a really good coach and you actually genuinely care about your athletes, you care about them beyond practice and the games. So what are some things that coaches can do to help their kids develop a healthy athletic identity? What do you guys think?
I think, thanks for answering. I think to like as a coach, to, you know, when you come to practice or whatever, and you're engaging with your athletes, have conversations with them and ask them about what they do outside of practice and sport. Like, hey, you know, you fish, you do, I don't know what people do, but like they do different things. I think it's just how you relate to your athletes, I think, is important. And so just encouraging them to have other hobbies, and then showing an interest in those. Like, hey, how was it last weekend doing this, and that? So that you show to them that they're more than an athlete, and that is great. That is good.
Yeah, I think in my experience, you know, I've coached high school swim before in the LA County area, and with that, we didn't have like the best swim team the Division IV swim team, maybe 2-3 of those kids out of 75 of them were going to go on to like a D3 for academics and maybe swim, or maybe go to a JUCO and swim. So these kids, they come to practice every day having fun. They come to practice every day talking about clubs that they're in. They're coming to practice every day. They're still swimming, right? I wasn't like, oh, you guys are swimming, you're not focused on your swimming. Yeah, they were focused on their swimming, but, after they would go out and get in and out together, or like before meets, they always has, like team lunches or stuff like that. So I think as a coach, for me, I was in a very, it was very easy for me, because these kids maybe didn't have that sort of like sole identity of swimming.
But if they did have a strong athletic identity, would you just let that roll, or would
I think
that's the hard part for coaches.
I think it's the hard part for coaches, especially at maybe the intercollegiate level or the elite level. But that's why whenever people talk about like getting into like coaching or things like that, start with kids that are youth athletes or younger athletes, because you're gonna understand kind of like the basics, right? The basics. And I feel very blessed to have been in that situation where I can really grasp that basic concept, right? Of these kids, they're here to have fun first, right?
Yes.
And just like you were saying, like then once you get to that elite level, you can then feel comfortable to ask them things like, hey, like what do you like to do outside of sport? Like who else are you, right? Figuring out those other pieces to the puzzle. Like, do you like to fish? I mean, I like to fish. Want to go fishing? You know what I mean? Maybe that's a little crossing that athlete coach boundary line, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's where it gets hard for coaches, because I think if you even at like a JUCO level, or even in some elite high school levels, like I'm trying to think about some of the high schools that are in our area out here in Orange County, they're highly competitive. I think that's where it's hard for coaches, because it's like on the one hand they might care about their athletes as human beings outside of their sport, but at a certain point, like they also need that intense focus on what they're doing. And from a coaching standpoint, if your athletes aren't focused or care about the game that's coming up, then their job is on the line to an extent too. So I think it's hard, and that's where our work with coaches can be really instrumental in like keeping them grounded in what their what's their philosophy. Why are they doing this in the first place?
I mean, if I would comment, I would say that think about the greatest coaches that we know about. I mean, what are they really famous for, and what do we admire them for? It's about like caring about. They genuinely care about their athletes, and they're interested in them. You know what I mean? They're curious about them, and you know what I mean? They love them. You know, and I think
Greg Pop.
Oh yeah.
Julio, your guys' group project on the Spurs. Talked about Pop being the legendary coach.
Yeah.
Caring about their athletes. Look at John Wooden. The basics, putting on your socks. Phil Jackson,
right?
Stuff like that. Yep.
So from what I'm hearing, it's like I feel like we're kind of all on the same page with this one. It's like encouraging coaches to build that relationship outside of sport with them, making sure that their athletes are engaging in other things outside of sport, and almost kind of seeing it as maybe a potential red flag if all their athletes ever want to talk to them about is the sport.
Yes.
And you're starting to get the vibe as a coach that this kid isn't doing anything else other than sport related stuff outside of practice and games.
Right. And I think the thing is too is like, because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to create an environment where your athletes feel confident and comfortable.
Hey Ryan.
Like, oh hey you joined us. If your athletes feel like you care about them genuinely, as an individual, I think it creates a safe space for them to, to take risks more and not be afraid of failure. Does that make sense? Where because I think
because you're decreasing that expectation, right?
Right.
Because the athletes aren't playing so tense. They feel comfortable with them. They're like, hey, Coach Brittany, she's not gonna get all pissed off if I miss this layup with my left hand, right? Like, it's okay.
It's just like the relationship thing. And I think when you have that relationship that goes beyond sport, that just happens, and I think you see results on the court or on the field. Like your athletes feel safe and they're not afraid of failure. because, you know what I mean? Like,
well, and I think that whole concept of failure, like you brought up a really good point, and you brought it up, like, it's failure becomes when you have that well-rounded identity, it goes from the world is ending if I miss this layup and I suck as a person, much less a player, to like, okay, I failed, let's try it again. And I think that's where that risk-taking inclination comes from, is they're no longer tying their personal self-worth to success or failure in that sport,
right?
Because
or
they know
the
that they're
reaction.
because they know that they're more than the game that they're playing.
And they're treated that way too.
Yep. And I think, you know, so if you're just joining us, we're talking about athletic identity.
There we go. Julio knows what I'm talking about.
Julio gets it. Yeah, building trust with being genuine. You know, if you get into any sort of profession, you know, us being mental performance consultants, coaching, you know, any sort of rehabilitation, just like earlier I was talking about, I had that conversation with one of my good friends who's a PT. The number one things that he focuses on is, one, rapport, building that relationship with his client, his patient, so that way they feel comfortable when he's going through certain exercises and things like that. And then also too, you know, when you're also looking at, like, he would even look at the psychosocial aspects of what that patient or athlete is going through, so that way they can get like the underpinning, you know, foundation of what they're actually going through, right? And then you can come in and talk to them like a person, rather than saying, hey, here's these exercises and go do it, right? And I'm sure Whitney, you could attest to this too, building rapport with your athletes before you actually just hand them a cookie cutter method, right? Is very impactful. So we're talking about how coaches can have that relationship with their athlete, which I think is huge. Thanks for joining us. Brittany's phone died.
So just
my phone died.
My followers were talking about athletic identity, and we kind of broke down what it is, why it's important for athletes to understand that they are more than the sport that they play, and how we as kinesiology professionals and mental performance people can help develop that athletic identity from a young age. But I guess kind of my next question is, what would be your guys' approach to, because a lot of times the athletes that we work with, we don't get them until they're in high school or college even. So at that point, maybe some of them didn't have that opportunity to be exposed and really develop that identity. And I know we talk about this all the time, like, it depends on the athlete because every athlete's different, but for maybe any athletes that we all have listening, what would be some hopeful pieces of advice that you guys would give to
Thanks,
for the athlete that already is in the thick of tying who they are to their sport?
I didn't really have a thought yet.
Do you have a thought? You're the one who asked the question.
Well, I mean, I realized I kind of shot myself in the foot with this one, because for all of us, our automatic go-to is it depends.
So you're saying if they're in the thick of it, and they're having that identity issue.
Yeah. So okay. So let's just create a case study for this right now. So let's go with a soccer athlete. Sorry, I'm throwing your sport under the bus here. A soccer athlete, let's say junior, senior high school, highly competitive school, highly competitive team, has just found out he's not getting a college scholarship and is not going to play soccer at the collegiate level. He's now in the thick of, what am I going to do now with my life, because all I know is soccer.
Junior college?
Well,
junior college?
I mean,
Does this athlete still want to go and continue on?
Let's say maybe they're, because of the self-worth and self-esteem tied up into that snowball effect, they're not sure. Maybe they're starting to devalue their skill.
I mean, I'll comment and say that happened to me. You know what I mean? That happened to me. I had a chance to play at the next level. It wasn't kind of at the level I wanted to. It was D3 or D4, and I was having identity issues, not playing to my potential, and struggling with pressure and things like that. And it got to a point where I burnt out, and really kind of went through a depression, I guess you could say. and decided to step away from the game. Eventually retired, but I think at that point it's you just gotta roll with that journey, and it's really just looking at yourself, reevaluating kind of who you are, finding other ways to identify yourself. I don't know. I think it's a personal journey.
Yeah.
It's a personal journey.
But I think having that social support, remember we talked about social support?
Yeah.
If you have that social support, they can really, like, maybe get you distracted a little bit or bring you back to awareness, like, hey, let's go do something else. Let's go play, like, laser tag or, or let's go do something, right? So that way you're not falling into this pit, which could lead to other things like maybe addictive issues and stuff like that.
Oh, say that.
But I think a huge part is that social aspect, making sure that they're there for you, and maybe they even bring that love back to the game for you, and you do decide to go back and play at the junior college level or club or intramural or anything like that.
Intramural, I did intramural, so that's fine.
Thanks for joining us.
So for you guys, it would be like distraction would be the way to go.
I don't know if I'd call it distraction.
No, I think it's
I would
support.
call it
Coping, yeah.
Yeah.
You're coping with it, yeah. Everybody's coping strategies are different, and we know from research that not one coping strategy is going to work for it's an individualized approach.
But support throughout the process. And being open to new things. Because here's the thing, and I'll make this last comment. I think for so long, sometimes athletes can be used to being the best at something, right? And then maybe they retire, they burn out, stuff happens, and then they're without their sport. And I think there's a transition period where you have to, you're not the star anymore, right? You're not the person that's good at everything they do, and you kind of have to rebuild, and you have to rebuild your friend circle sometimes too, and that can be hard. So just be aware of that. I have you on Sunday.
Sorry, text messages coming in.
I'd be curious, like, knowing, because your fiance is an athletic trainer, and so I'm sure she deals with, especially from the injury standpoint, with, and if Erin's still watching, chime in, Erin.
I don't think she is.
She might have dipped out.
Yeah.
Oh, Lauren's
We got the three strong.
Hey, Lauren and Brandon, thanks for...
Brandon, you sent me a question. Shoot that question again. I can't see it anymore. Can I scroll? Oh, yeah, he asked a question.
What I'm curious, like, what from like an athletic training standpoint would you recommend in terms of helping athletes develop that identity and kind of exploring that once they're injured or through like the treatment or rehab process?
Yeah, the rehabilitation process for an injury is huge, and that's number one when we go back to the puzzle pieces, like trying to get them like what are other things that we can do, and maybe their injury is to the point where they can't walk anymore, right? So then you have to kind of set like many steps along the way, like, okay, we're not worried so much about getting you back on the pitch like to play soccer. We're going to be worried about getting you to 90 degrees or get you on a bike to in order to get leg strength back or maybe even to walk, right?
Yeah, that's hard.
And I think helping them recognize those things, they're able to get motivated because in the long run they want to get back and play soccer if that's their goal. And that helps them along the process. But as far as the identity piece, right, they lose a big chunk. Like they're in this kind of like dark place. Like, man, like maybe I was an Olympic athlete and I was training for the Olympics, and all of a sudden, I had my leg amputated from a crash, right?
Oh, man.
So, right, what are you going to do in that instance? So I think that's largely the reason why physical therapy is now a doctoral degree, because you have to understand the biopsychosocial kind of factors that tie into injury. And that's why, like I was saying, my buddy, goes through this every day. He looks at the reports and he says, what are some of the psychological factors that they're dealing with? And most of the time it's like self-esteem, it's identity, and it's about kind of recognizing like other things that they like to do, like you were mentioning before, like what are some other things that you'd like to do, what can we start focusing on, and not making sure that when that conversation, when they come and see you, it's not always about their sport, because they might have flashbacks and they might recognize like, oh, like I am out of my sport, this is a long road, versus kind of talking to them about other things like what's going on at home, like how's family, things like that. Anything that we need to talk about today as far as like getting you to that 90-degree flexion. And I think having like a mental performance consultant to help with that is great. But a lot of the times the doctoral level degrees at, you know, the rehabilitation standpoint, they learn a lot of that stuff. But they meet with people like us frequently to kind of like aid them along the process.
Which is good.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, because I think what a lot of people fail to realize is, like, especially when it's kind of more of an elite level performance situation, that injury and being in the rehab process really leaves you in this limbo period.
Yeah.
And it's like you're not out of your sport completely, but you're not in your sport completely. And so it's like you don't know whether you're gonna go one way or the other yet. Kind of thing. And so I think that's an important piece too.
Yeah. And also too, from our standpoint, when we look at like psychological coping strategies, right, we have obviously we want people to have the more like positivity, kind of think of like an Adrian Peterson tears his ACL, wants to come back the next season, almost breaks the rushing yardage for the season. As soon as he tore his ACL, it was, I'm going to get back stronger. I'm going to get back faster. Thanks for joining us.
Do you know who that is?
So we're talking about getting back from certain injuries and coping strategies. So we have the positivity route where, like, we're talking about Adrian Peterson, you know, wanting to come back bigger, stronger, faster. And we also have those that they just want to find out everything there is to their injury. You know, they go through a very analytical process, and that was my case when I had my ACL. It was like, doctor, tell me everything that you learned in your PhD program. I want to know everything there is to everything about this knee. And that helped me cope, because you learn where things are connected, and you get a more clear understanding as to like, why is this injury happening to me, versus kind of like, you know, the classic denial, anger, frustration, depression, and then acceptance. This was more of like, this was my coping strategy, right? And then you have the third major component, which is like the emotional piece, right, where people go through the anger, they go through the depression, they go through the frustration. So I think individualizing the coping strategies. Hey Omar, thanks for joining us.
Do you want to get to Brandon's question? He asked that a while ago.
Yeah, Brandon, sorry man, we kind of went on this big tangent and we got into some good stuff. How to build rapport with teams, coaches, athletes. I think number one for me is being authentic. When you come in with a coach, sitting down with them, being yourself. It's like when you go into an interview, you take a deep breath right before you do an interview. At the end of the day, a very good interview is one where you were like, that didn't even feel like an interview. That felt like I was just having a conversation, right? And not so just like uptight. And we know that tension is going to lead to like a lot of different hormonal factors that might play into the stress response in the body. But I think just being authentic, that's my number one thing. You want to add to that?
I would say listen. Just listen to your athletes and show a genuine interest in them. Be curious about them. I think people love that in general when you're making relationships. It's just when you're interested in them, I mean, that's how you build that relationship. So I would say listen to your athletes, figure out what makes them tick, what motivates them, what their fears are, show them that you care, that you support them no matter what. You care about them outside of the sport, but I would just say listen to them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you guys covered a lot of it. My big thing is kind of like the old school, like, be quick to listen, slow to speak, like, be willing to ask more questions than they ask you, and be willing to let those questions go beyond sport stuff. And, you know, but at the same time, athletes know that athletes smell bullshit a mile away. Especially kids. Like, the younger they are, like, the younger they are, the better they are at it. I mean, but so I think just coming from that authentic place of caring, and I think as a coach, that goes back to why are you doing this in the first place?
Yep.
You know.
What are you doing it for?
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us today. I think that kind of wraps up thing. I think my phone's almost dead. Frances' phone's almost dead. And Brittany's is long gone. If you have any other questions, shoot me a DM. Brandon, thanks for joining us. Everybody else who was here, really appreciate it.
Same.
If you have any other questions, reach out in the DMs and we'll get back to you.
This was fun, guys.
Cool. Hopefully we do this again.
Yeah, let's do it again.
Thank you guys.
All right.
Thanks,
See
guys.
ya.
We out.